The film starts by showing Ray, a prisoner in a modern jail who decides to join the Spiderhead Project. This program conducts tests on chemicals that change human feelings. In return for taking part, volunteers like Ray get a better life compared to normal jail conditions. The next day, the story focuses on Jeff, another prisoner involved in an unexpected test. Blindfolded, Jeff is taken outside, wondering what's going on. They give him N40, a drug that changes his perception. When he removes the blindfold, he's amazed by the colors and scenery. To express what he's experiencing, they give him B5, which helps him talk better. Under the effect of B15, Jeff's descriptions become really poetic. But he doesn't know that the place he's seeing is actually contaminated, just looking beautiful because of the drug. After the experiment, Jeff shares his experience with Lizzie, another prisoner. Later, in his room, Jeff starts drawing and thinks about the accident that led to his imprisonment. He and his friend Adam had too much to drink at a party, leading to a car crash that killed Adam. This painful memory serves as a stark reminder of Jeff's past and the reasons behind his current situation in the Spiderhead program. The next day, the atmosphere among the inmates noticeably lifts, and Jeff finds himself once again part of an experimental session. This time, he partners with Heather, a fellow prisoner who is widely considered attractive. When asked to rate Heather's appeal, Jeff gives her a high score of 8 out of 10, showing how he sees her physically. But when it's Heather's turn to rate Jeff, she gives him a score below 5, which is a sharp contrast to Jeff's rating of her. However, their dynamic changes dramatically after they both receive Nur, the drug that had altered Jeff's perception before. Under its influence, they start feeling strange sensations, and their body language changes significantly. Suddenly, they're strongly drawn to each other, a big shift from their initial interactions. With the addition of B15, they openly admire each other's beauty, pleasing Steve and Mark, who are closely watching the experiment. As the drug's effects intensify, Jeff and Heather's bond deepens, leading to a passionate encounter right there. Afterward, they declare their love for each other. Steve tells Mark to monitor them to see if the drug's effects last even after it wears off. In the next task, Jeff is tasked with distributing food, including some for Heather. Their interaction this time is awkward, and they barely speak. Despite Steve's hopes, the intense feelings they had under the drug's influence fade away. Unfazed by this, Steve decides to repeat the experiment, this time pairing Jeff with Sarah, an older woman whom Jeff isn't initially attracted to. Despite his initial lack of interest, Jeff, under the influence of a double dose of N40, ends up in another passionate encounter with her. The next day, while checking Jeff's MIPAC as part of routine maintenance, Mark warns about how delicate the device is, especially during physical activities like sex. Even a small bump could harm it, potentially causing the drugs to be released uncontrollably. Seeing this as a chance, Jeff asks for a change in his duties, suggesting he needs different responsibilities. However, his request hints at something deeper, suggesting Jeff might have plans beyond what's obvious. Later in the movie, Steve, the head of the experimental program, joins Jeff for a talk. During their discussion, Steve brings up Darkenflox, a drug known for causing intense negative feelings like dread and anxiety. He talks about giving Darkenflox to either Heather or Sarah. Jeff, having suffered from Darkenflox himself, strongly disagrees with this idea. He doesn't want to subject any woman to such distress, understanding the pain it could cause. After Jeff refuses, Steve changes the topic to his plan of using N40 to create feelings of love between people. As they talk, Steve digs deeper, asking Jeff about his deepest desires. Jeff shares his wish to go back in time and prevent the tragic events that changed his life, the night when Adam died. As Christmas nears, Jeff decides to celebrate early with Lizzie, another inmate. Later, Jeff takes part in another experiment. He finds himself in a room with a big guy and assumes he's going to be given N40 again, which annoys him. Refusing to participate, Jeff leaves in frustration and goes to the control room. There, he meets Heather, who's being pressured to decide who should get Darkenflox. Jeff's irritation turns into anger, but Steve steps in, trying to soothe him. Steve tries to justify their situation, highlighting that their lives in the facility are better than they would be in a regular prison. Slowly, Jeff starts to understand Steve's perspective and apologizes for his outburst. Eventually, reluctantly agreeing with Steve's viewpoint, that evening, with Mark away for the weekend, Steve is left alone. He dances in his room, revealing a surprising detail: Steve himself possesses a MIPAC. In a moment of solitude, Steve administers N40 to himself. On the next Monday, Jeff finds himself with Lizzie. He confides in her about his encounters with Darkenflox and the mental toll of the experiments. He talks about how the experiments have begun to affect his mind, sometimes struggling to recall his identity before his imprisonment. However, he mentions that being with Lizzie helps him feel more like himself, showing the meaningful bond he has formed with her amidst the chaos of the Spiderhead program. Later in the story, tension rises as Steve takes a risky move by instructing Mark to prepare a triple dose of chemicals. Jeff witnesses this but stays silent, watching as they hastily hide their actions. The next phase of the experiment involves a tough choice. According to Steve, the committee funding Spiderhead insists that Jeff administer Darkenflox to one of the women. Despite Steve's insistence, Jeff stands firm, refusing to subject Heather or any other woman to Darkenflox. He urges Steve to appeal to the committee. Steve pretends to make a call but instead chats with Lizzie in the kitchen. Upon his return, Steve falsely tells Jeff that the committee rejected any changes and threatens to send him back to prison if he doesn't comply. Jeff reluctantly agrees to give Darkenflox to Heather. As she takes the dose, she starts showing signs of extreme discomfort, becoming agitated and restless, overwhelmed by emotional and physical distress. The situation becomes perilous when Heather, in her distressed state, starts banging her head against the wall and throwing objects. This leads to damage to her Mobipack, causing the drugs to be administered uncontrollably. Mark rushes to help, but things get out of hand, and Heather, unable to handle the effects of Darkenflox, takes her own life. Afterward, Steve hurries into Heather's room and accidentally drops his keys. Jeff seizes the chance to access Steve's desk compartment, where he discovers the shocking truth. There's no committee, Spiderhead belongs solely to Steve. The drug names were randomly chosen from a bingo card, except for two. N40 doesn't have a star as it hasn't found true love yet, and B6 is the drug Mark regularly fills in everyone's Mobipacks. As Steve senses something wrong and returns, Jeff replaces the key without raising suspicion, keeping his finding under wraps. Later, Steve urges Mark to keep the incident with Heather quiet, fearing repercussions from the authorities. Steve tries to comfort Jeff but fails. He shares the tested drug with Ree, resulting in uncontrollable laughter. Steve then opens up about his past, including being abandoned by his father at 8. He admits his dedication to the Spiderhead project as a quest for true love, consuming his life and actions. The story takes a darker turn as Steve decides to give Darkenflox to Lizzie. This potent drug causes alarming reactions in Lizzie, leading to strange behavior and an irrational fear of a harmless object, a staple. Lizzie later confides in Jeff about her terrifying experience with the drug. During this vulnerable moment, Jeff shares his past, confessing to a painful truth. He reveals that a car accident he caused not only killed his friend but also took the life of his girlfriend. This shared vulnerability brings Lizzie and Jeff closer, resulting in an embrace, a kiss, and an intimate moment between them. Observing how Jeff and Lizzie interact, Steve starts noticing their growing fondness for each other. Instead of showing concern or disapproval, Steve appears curious, even thrilled, by the idea of their budding relationship. This reaction suggests there might be a deeper, possibly darker motive behind his experiments. Later that night, Steve gives Jeff a troubling ultimatum. He insists that Lizzie must receive Darkenflox. Jeff reacts strongly. He gets furious, firmly opposing Steve's demand and refusing to let Lizzie suffer from Darkenflox. Despite Jeff's anger, Steve tries to calm him down, proposing they meet in the lab the next morning to discuss things further. In a crucial turn of events, Mark, Steve's assistant, pays a visit to Jeff's room. During their conversation, Jeff confronts Mark about Steve's true intentions behind the experiments. He reveals that Steve is primarily focused on a drug called B6, known as the red drug. As Jeff shares these details, Mark realizes the gravity of his involvement in Steve's plans. He acknowledges that he has made a significant mistake in supporting Steve's unethical experiments. The next morning brings a significant change when Mark doesn't show up for work unexpectedly. With Mark absent, Steve entrusts Jeff with the control tablet, instructing him to give Darkenflox to Lizzie. However, Jeff refuses, prompting Steve to reveal Lizzie's backstory to justify his demands. Steve reveals that Lizzie was arrested because she left her daughter in the car, leading to the child's tragic death. By portraying Lizzie in a negative light, Steve tries to convince Jeff to administer Darkenflox. In a critical moment, Jeff cleverly switches the control on the tablet to Steve's own Mobipack. After giving a series of drugs, including B6, Jeff discovers the true purpose of the experiment, testing B6, an obedience drug. He realizes that all the volunteers, including himself, have been influenced by it. However, the drug hasn't been entirely successful, as subjects resist orders that go against what they hold dear. Steve shares surprising truths with Jeff. Jeff had finished serving his prison sentence 7 months earlier, while Lizzie's request for release had been granted just the week before. Knowing this, Jeff pressures Steve to unlock the main entrance and set Lizzie free. But when Jeff asks Steve for a pocket knife, Steve refuses, indicating that his dedication to the project is his top priority. In a desperate move, Steve attacks Jeff and takes control of the tablet. He then administers a deadly dose of Darkenflox to Lizzie, causing her to spiral into a state of hysteria and suicidal thoughts. Jeff and Steve engage in a fierce struggle for control. Although Jeff disarms Steve, he damages his own Mobipack in the process. Jeff rushes to help Lizzie, removing the Darkenflox vials and professing his love for her. Meanwhile, Steve, briefly regaining control, orders other inmates to capture Jeff and Lizzie. Despite the odds, Jeff and Lizzie fend off some of the inmates, securing the main door as they flee from Spiderhead. As they escape, Mark and the police are spotted heading towards the island. In a dramatic twist, Steve, still affected by the drugs, attempts a joyous but delusional getaway on a floatplane, leading to a crash into a mountain due to his impaired judgment. The tale ends with Jeff and Lizzie seizing the chance to leave the island's horrors behind. They use a motorboat to depart Spiderhead, signifying the end of their challenging ordeal and the start of their journey to freedom. Turn on alerts, like, and subscribe for more videos similar to this one. Thank you for watching.